By now, most of us have heard of the Surgeon General's declaration that loneliness is a public health crisis, that being lonely is equivalent in terms of all-cause mortality of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, that the numbers of friends that Americans have has dropped precipitously. In 1990, 33% of Americans reported having 10 or more close friends. By 2021, that number had dropped to 13%. Perhaps more troubling is the fact that in 1990, only 3% reported having no close friends. By 2021, the number of people reporting no close friends had quadrupled. It's truly a major challenge in societies around the world. But today we're very fortunate to be joined by Noreena Hertz, who's been thinking and writing about the loneliness epidemic even before COVID pushed the topic to the top of public conversation. In 2021, she labeled our times as the lonely century. In a terrific book of that very name, she explores the cause of our atomistic times, raises the alarm of what is going on, and proposes, to quote the subtitle of the book, how to restore human connection in a world that's pulling apart. A little bit about Noreena. She's an honorary professor at University College London and the author of 5 best-selling books. She's been variously described as one of the world's leading young thinkers and one of the most influential economists on the world stage. And I feel very fortunate to have her here with us today to discuss the loneliness epidemic in her wonderful book. Thank you, Noreena, for being with us today.
Thank you for hosting me.
Before we turn over to Martha, who is going to brave her way through a sore throat, I want to remind you all that we're taking your questions starting right now. Please put any questions you may have into the Q&A. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Martha.
So it's laryngitis, not a sore throat. So bear with me as I've got
worse than a sore throat. Yeah.
Noreena, thanks for joining us. And I have to tell you, I really enjoyed reading the book and have dog-eared a number of things that I hope we touch on over the next hour or so. The loneliness epidemic certainly has been in the media lately. And I was struck by something you just told us as we were getting ready for this interview, that you started looking at this topic 6 years ago. What attracted you to it? What sort of put it on your radar?
Great question. It was actually 3 distinct things. The first was my students. So I was teaching at university, and I realized that more and more of my students were confiding in me in office hours that they were feeling lonely. And this was something I really hadn't seen to this degree at all 10 years before, so 5 years before even. So I thought, what's going on? Why are all these young people so lonely? Then I was researching from my research the rise of right-wing populism across the globe, of leaders like Donald Trump in America, but of Salvini in Italy, of Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, of Le Pen in France. And as I started digging into the academic literature, but also interviewing numerous people who are voting for these parties, what came across from their stories and from the academic literature was this link between populism and loneliness. So lonely people turning to populist leaders, my students lonely. And then I had bought an Amazon Alexa, and I started observing my own interactions with my Alexa. And I realized that, to some degree, I was having a relationship with this device that lives in my kitchen, who was kind of nice to have around and who I was feeling increasingly close to. And so it got me thinking about what I came to define as the loneliness economy, an entire economy made up of goods and services designed really to deliver connection or community. This is even before the pandemic. And I thought, okay, the market is seeing a demand for these products. My students are lonely, a group I hadn't actually thought of previously as being potentially lonely, and this link between voting and loneliness. And I thought, I really want to dig into this subject more. And so I did. And as soon as I started really digging into it, I realized that, as you laid out, Ken, that we were in the midst of, not only in the States, but actually a global loneliness crisis of a scale that I had not realized at all. In the United States, around 50% of Americans feel lonely regularly. 1 in 3 people feel lonely every single day. 1 in 5 millennials don't have a single friend. 2 in 5 retirees say that their main form of company is their television or pet. So 50% of office workers are lonely at work. So, the numbers are real and big and significant. And so I thought, I need to understand what's going on here, what's driving this, and importantly, what can we do about it?
I think the global nature of the problem was what surprised me. I mean, we certainly talk about it here in the States and other developed countries, but the thesis you laid out about it being a global problem is pretty scary, One of the things you talk about early in the book is that you have a different definition of loneliness than is often used in the literature. Can you talk a little bit more about that and why you chose to sort of define it differently?
Yes, so I define loneliness as not only a feeling of being disconnected from friends and family, and wanting to feel close to them, but not being able to, but also a sense of being disconnected from your fellow citizens, from your politicians, from your political leaders, from your employer, from your workplace. So I'm defining loneliness as an existential state of being that is economic, political, and social. And I wanted to define it in this way. There was precedent for defining it in this broader way. And, in academia, we try and build often on the shoulders of kind of great thinkers who've come before us. So I wasn't the first person to think of this wider definition. If you look at the work of Emil Durkheim, the sociologist, he kind of had a broader definition of loneliness, or the work of Hannah Arendt. She had this broader, more political definition of loneliness as well. So other thinkers had this insight, but to me, it made sense to define loneliness in this broader way, and helped explain, therefore, not only a personal state, but a kind of societal and political state that we're all witnessing to.
So given this broad definition, is anyone not lonely?
Yeah, there are, even with a broader definition, I mean, for sure. There are people who feel more connected to others. There are people who feel embedded in communities. There are people who feel that they do have friends. Yeah. So yes, it's not all lost, and there's much to play for.
So go ahead, Ken.
So actually, I want to ask, you want to go ahead, Martha?
No, go ahead.
Sure. All right. So no, after you. So Noreena, why now? I mean, your book lays out a number of reasons why now. I would love to sort of explore why you think, what is it about technology or capitalism that is, both of which you sort of indict, that is causing this global loneliness crisis now?
So there are many reasons, with these complex issues. Of course, there are going to be a number of drivers. We do less with other people than in the past. So we're less likely to go to church. We're less likely to be members of trade unions. We're less likely to attend parent-teacher association meetings. So we do less with others than in the past. Mass urbanization. Cities are particularly lonely, but so are rural communities, which have been hollowed out because of mass urbanization. So that's a problem too. The rise of contactless living, something kind of that the pandemic, of course, accelerated, but the fact that we will order our food on Grubhub rather than go to a cafe, that we'll do our yoga with Adrienne on YouTube rather than go to a gym. So kind of habits that had begun before the pandemic that were accelerated, part of the problem as well. Technology, of course, a driver there. But then, as you say, a couple of additional drivers that are important to acknowledge. Technology, our smartphones. I began my research pretty agnostic about the role that smartphones and social media in particular played in today's loneliness crisis, but having really dug into the literature, conducted many interviews, done surveys, I've come away feeling very strongly that the link between social media and loneliness, cannot be overstated. In fact, people had thought that there was a relationship for quite a while, but it was hard up until about 4 years ago to establish this categorically. And it was actually research done at Stanford that I think was the first kind of gold standard piece of research, which really showed, this is actually causal, where researchers got a group of students to continue using Facebook as usual, and then had a group of students go off Facebook for 3 months, and then they monitored them very closely. And what they found was that the group who went off Facebook, social media actually more broadly, but including Facebook, was significantly happier and significantly less lonely. And there've been a number of studies since then. So social media, and we can go into the reasons why, but social media clearly a driver. And we see this especially amongst young people, where there's been this massive rise in loneliness since 2012, when smartphones became ubiquitous, pretty much in lockstep with smartphone adoption since 2012. So social media, clearly part of the problem. And then, yes, capitalism. Now, I'm not anti-capitalism, let me be clear. I'm actually in New York for a board meeting for a publicly traded company whose board I sit on. So I'm not anti-capitalist, but what I do argue is that part of the problem is what we might think of as our neoliberal mindset. And by this, I mean really a mindset that started taking hold in the 1980s. If we think back to movies like Wall Street, with slogans like greed is good, a mindset which essentially kind of came to redefine ourselves as competitors rather than collaborators, as hustlers rather than helpers, as takers rather than givers, and kind of lionized these qualities within society. Greed is good, self-interest was good. And what we see very clearly, actually, is that the more individualistic a society, the lonelier the society is. The more selfish we are as individuals, the more lonely our society is. And we actually see this rise in individualism. There was a study which I really like, where researchers looked at pop song lyrics from the 1980s onwards, and what they saw was that words such as we, us, and our were steadily being supplanted by words like I, me, myself. In the 1980s. And of course, an I-focused world is inevitably going to be a lonelier world. So I think that's when I'm talking about kind of the neoliberal mindset and the role it plays, there's that. But there's something else which I think needs acknowledging as well, is that the infrastructure of community has been really devastated since the 2008 financial crisis. This isn't only in the United States, but it's true in the United States as well, where we've seen since 2008, when governments had to start cutting back, public libraries being closed down, youth clubs being closed down, community centers being closed down. And of course, if people don't have places to do things together, to be things together, well, they are going to be more lonely. So that's been part of the problem as well. So lots and lots of drivers here. Which actually means lots can be done.
And we will get to the what can be done shortly, because I'd like to feel optimistic about where we're going. But we're getting a couple of questions in on the chat, but I have one follow-up. Given one of the drivers is social media, and given that your initial interest in this topic was your experience with college students, do you see any generational differences in loneliness, or is it an epidemic being experienced by people of all ages equally?
So it is being experienced by people of all ages, but not equally. So there are two age groups who are the most lonely, the elderly and the young. And actually the young are the loneliest by quite a significant degree. So the young really, very lonely. And the stories of teenagers who I interviewed as part of my research were really heartbreaking. And again, the link between their experiences on social media and how it made them feel were very clear. There was a 14-year-old boy who told me about how he would post on Instagram and then be desperately hoping for somebody to like one of his posts, and when they didn't, he would feel so alone, he told me. Or a girl, 16-year-old girl, whose friends had said that they were going out after high school, that they weren't going out after class, and she was on her feeds and she saw them all hanging out without her, and she said she felt so excluded. She hung out in her room, and of course, you know, kids were excluded in the past, but today what's happening is that firstly, this exclusion is public, so everyone sees it. Secondly, it kind of haunts you 24/7. And thirdly, the adults in a kid's life who in the past might have seen what was going on, might have seen a kid not being asked to sit with others, often isn't even aware that the exclusion is going on, because you know, a child might just have been not invited to be in the WhatsApp group, or not invited to take part in something that was happening through social media as well. So that's another form of exclusion we're seeing, digital exclusion.
I can't hear you.
Can't hear me?
Now we can.
Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry. I'm going to bring in a couple questions from the audience and try to combine there, because it's interesting. I think it's sort of, is there a good side to social media? There's a promise that was made that somehow social media would bring us together, help people who are at distance from each other, or help people of like interests find each other. And I think there's a question about, is there a good side to what we have now? And does AI promise, you know, since that you're already friends with Alexa, is the next generation Alexa going to be your best friend? Be our best friend? So I think those two questions for the audience that bundle together as one.
Really great questions. So yes, there is a good side of social media. Often, you know, if you're the LGBTQ kid in some kind of rural, small community where there may not be other people like you, social media, you know, has been historically and can be a place to find people who you identify with, who are like you. Illnesses, people who have chronic illnesses or kind of rare illnesses often have found real support through groups who they found on Facebook, for example. So, you know, so there definitely are use cases. But when I'm talking kind of general and net good or net bad, and I would say net bad. And you know, if you think about the tribalism that social media fuels and rewards, if you think about the bullying and abuse that is prevalent on social media every day in the United Kingdom, a third of female students have actively experienced abuse on social media. 65% of young people have experienced cyberbullying. If you think about that feeling that when you're scrolling through your feeds that everyone seems to be more popular than you are because everyone seems to have more friends and be doing more things, that also inspires a sense of kind of relative loneliness. So for a number of reasons, I'd say net bad, but of course there are cases where it is good. AI, great question. I actually, as part of my research, did look at robots and the role that robots are playing already, or were playing already a few years ago when I was doing this research in alleviating loneliness. It's in Japan where we see this most predominantly when it comes to elderly care, where social robots have really played a significant role now for quite a few years in delivering companionship as well as care. And there are, you know, even cases of Japanese women knitting bonnets for their robot carers because they've become so attached to them. With AI, you know, this is inevitably going to increase the opportunity for us to have companionship and friendship, even with AI and increasingly emotionally savvy AI robots, and which begs the question: is this a good or a bad thing? Of course, yeah. And I think from a personal level, I actually think it can be a good thing. You know, there's a robotics company, an Israeli robotics company called LEQ, which actually is doing some pilot studies in the United States at the moment, in New York, and did a study in Florida as well. And the stories are actually incredibly heartwarming of elderly people who were feeling very isolated and alone, who now have their robots and are feeling that they have a friend, that they're not so alone. So from a personal level, I actually think this is, it really can play a part in alleviating loneliness, AI. From a societal level, I do have concerns, because those skills that we are forced to practice in real world friendships, reciprocity, thinking about someone else and not only ourselves, that give and take, we wouldn't have to do that with a robot at all. So if we were to migrate our relationships to robots, I think the societal consequences could be dire. But I can see robots as playing actually an important role at an individual level when it comes to playing a part in alleviating loneliness.
So you describe in the book a little bit of a dystopian future, where people are sort of by themselves, they order food by themselves, they work by themselves, and now they have relationships by themselves. It does sound like it is at least potentially a step into much more a world where we really don't need to communicate with anyone else.
Yeah, and then of course, what are the political implications of a world in which we feel increasingly disconnected from others, and increasingly that we don't owe anyone else anything or need anyone else? Big ramifications.
I commented before that the one of the points in the book that I found really interesting was the global nature of this epidemic. You choose to focus on a couple of locations throughout the book. What led you to these locations? London and Japan.
Yeah, I looked, well, I think I tried when I was writing my book to look pretty globally. So I have, being based in the UK, I guess I had a slight UK bias, but I have a lot of American stories and data in there as well. A lot from Japan, a lot from South Korea, and in terms of what to do about it, examples from as far afield as Rwanda, Germany, Japan, South Korea, United Kingdom, Belgium. But one of the things that really struck me, actually, when the book came out, and over this past 2 years, when it's been coming out in country after country after country, it's now in around 20 countries. The book's been published. I find really clear is the extent to which it's resonating in country after country, that it really is a global problem. One that I kind of had hypothesized it was, but I didn't have data from every single country when I was doing the research, but which has been kind of validated by the fact that it's really striking a chord in places as far afield as Sweden, or trying to think of where someone that's diametrically opposed to Sweden, Sweden or America.
I do want to go back to some of the questions, sort of the root cause of this. Forgive me for bouncing around a little bit. Most of the book talks about technology, almost sort of root the problems in one of your early answers, sort of 2002 with the sort of the growth of the iPhone and things like that. But you also referenced the book Bob Putnam, who's been writing about these. His book came out in 2000, but his research goes back to decline institutions like churches and unions and knitting circles, back to the 80s. I'm curious whether you see that same history here, and whether that's part of the solution, if it is.
Yes, I definitely do. And Robert Putnam was a big inspiration for me. I remember first reading Bowling Alone, and just being blown away by the research and by the thesis, which I found really kind of compelling. Although we had some kind of differences in what we thought and what we think the drivers are, but definitely part of it, of course, is the fact that we do less together. Which makes sense. The fact that we're just having less in-person interactions and shared experiences is definitely part of it. And that lack of increasing kind of individualism, lack of solidarity that comes with not going to church or mosque or synagogue, or not being part of a labor union. So those are clearly part of the problem, and part of the solution, therefore, inevitably is to do more with other people. But that's partly, not exclusively, but that partly ties with the fact, people need these physical spaces and places to do things. So what will the cathedrals of this century look like? What will be the what are the secular spaces where people can come together? Who's going to fund it? These are all questions we need to be asking and addressing, recognizing, of course, that there's a self-interested case to do so, because as you pointed out, in your introduction, loneliness, terrible for our health, as bad for us as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, terrible for the economy, not only in terms of the healthcare costs, but also because lonely workers are less motivated, less productive, more likely to quit than workers who are not, and terrible for democracy, as my research has shown. So lots of reasons to do something about it, but big questions to be asked around, well, who's going to fund these? Who's going to fund this? Are people actually, what will it take for people to actually do something? And part of it is just laying out very clearly the self-interested case.
I ask you, just as mentioned a number of times in the book, I think very important, the relationship between loneliness and political polarization and the crap fest of politics we're in now. I think that's a technical term. Can you sort of talk about that connection, and why is there a connection between lonely and some of the political fixes we find ourselves in?
Yeah. So researchers kind of started looking at this subject, a few researchers, probably about 15 years ago now. And there were researchers in Scandinavia who looked at people who were voting for right populist parties at that time and the number of friends they had. And they found that they had less friends than the people on average, than the people who were voting for non-populist parties. Researchers in France saw that Le Pen, not Marine Le Pen, but her father, Jean Le Pen's constituency, were more likely to feel socially isolated. So there had been people, about 10, 15 years ago, who had already started looking at that. So I had this kind of inkling that maybe this was going on now. And then there was some more contemporary research in 2016. There were researchers in the United States who compared Trump voters with Clinton and Bernie Sanders voters, found that Trump voters had, on average, less friends, less acquaintances, did less with other people, had less people, they said, that they could rely upon. So there was this kind of some empirical data out there, but I wanted to dig into it more. So I started interviewing people who were voting for these parties, not only in the United States, but in France, in Germany, and in Italy as well. And what came out of their stories was very clearly that these were people who had felt lonely, both in the sense of not having people to hang out with, do things with, feeling kind of isolated, but also lonely in that sense of feeling invisible, ignored, unseen. So loneliness in both those ways being felt by these people who were then finding community in kind of a very tangible sense in the rallies, in the meetings, in the kind of gatherings that right populist politicians have been particularly adept at delivering, but also feeling seen and heard by politicians who are really kind of weaponizing the language of community and the language of togetherness, and to prey on this constituency. And, and speaking, if you look at the rhetoric of Trump, Le Pen, Salvini, Alternative for Deutschland, it's actually Giorgia Meloni, it's actually, they're all very similar, kind of evoking, using phrases like "you, the forgotten people," using, kind of talking about kind of family, really emphasizing you'll be heard. And of course, also playing to another aspect of loneliness, which is that when you are lonely, you are more likely to see the world as a threatening, hostile place. Of course, not everyone who's lonely sees the world as a more threatening and hostile place, but you are more likely to. And right populist politicians really playing to this, of course, with their message of belonging, but only for a particular group. So, build the wall, or, we the people. So speaking to that as well. So those are a few kind of components to that story.
It's kind of ironic that it's the tactic is to create community among those who feel disconnected from community.
Yeah.
So, could I ask you about elder loneliness? You said there were two groups who are more susceptible to loneliness, with very different sort of profiles, youth and elder. We talked a little bit about youth. What are the challenges of how is elder loneliness different from other types of loneliness, and how do you think about that challenge?
I think there are lots of similarities. I mean, again, it's about, being isolated, not having people one feels one can hang out with or rely upon, and that sense of feeling invisible and powerless. So I think elderly loneliness speaks to all of those elements as well. What can be done about it? Well, clearly we do need to do something about it, and and part of the solution has to be in again, back to spaces where elderly people can do things together. There's a wonderful example from South Korea, which are they're called kolotex. These are daytime discotheques, where tens of thousands of elderly people dance during the day together, which I absolutely love the idea of, and I hope that I'll be in my 80s dancing at daytime discotheques. But what are the physical spaces, and where are what are the opportunities for entrepreneurs and of course for business people here, recognizing that there is this demand. So I think there is a market driven solution, which is part of how we address elderly loneliness for sure. So whether it is the social robots like LEQ, whether it is things like the kolotex, I think that's part of it. Government, of course, at a kind of national or at a local level, also has a role to play here. Not only having kind of physical spaces to do things, but also, thinking about, how will people get from point A to point B? Are there bus routes? Are there services so that people can actually, because that's part of the problem often, is that people are kind of physically trapped wherever they are. So what's being done to address that? So things that governments can do. Legislation around care, paid time off to care. This is something where, the United States in general, I think it's fair to say, is lagging behind other countries, perhaps, even when on things like maternity pay. But more broadly, we need to move towards people being able to have paid time off a certain number of days to care, whether it is for kids or for an elderly relative, or even for a friend. So and employers can do this as well. And we do have some companies actually who are pioneering this, who are actually giving employees a certain number of paid days off to care. There's a number of kind of Salesforce in the United States or Centrica in the United Kingdom both do this. So so there are things that governments can do, that employers can do to help, and of course things that we can do ourselves. If we have an elderly person in our own lives who we think might be lonely, can we reach out to them more, pick up the phone, arrange to meet them? So things that we can do ourselves, and also opportunities for elderly people to contribute more, because often, if you're giving, volunteering, doing things for others is a great way to, of course, not only help other people, but also feel less lonely yourself. So are there more opportunities for a kind of volunteer army of elderly people, for example? And of course, are more opportunities in the workplace, because workplaces are lonely, but not being in work is even lonelier. So I think lots of potential solutions on that front.
I want to jump in here. We at the center not only talk about physical spaces that allow people to engage, we talk about the importance of intergenerational connections. And when you were talking about the daytime discotheques, my 21-year-old college junior is spending the fall in Seoul, Korea, and texted me 2 weeks ago about going to a daytime discotheque. And
Really?
the picture I got was every generation. Well, it was, Mom, you would have felt comfortable here too. So, yeah, I had never heard of them, but I thought it was great and they had a great time.
Yeah, that is such a great point. Intergenerational. I mean, most of the over 80 people I know don't want to just hang out with people of their age. They want to hang out with a range of ages. And so I think, yes. And there are also actually some really interesting kind of co-living projects going on in Europe with intergenerational living, and which have been super successful in terms of making both the young and the older participants feel more connected and part of a community.
So a couple of interesting comments that I think sort of loop into this. There was a question that said, in a recent survey conducted in France, people felt more isolated were people between 50 and 59 versus older. So the middle age, not the old. Do you find something similar in other countries?
I haven't. No, I haven't seen that. That isn't to say that isn't the case, but I haven't seen that. Most, I guess a lot of the data isn't so granular. So you have age groups, but that's really interesting. So thank you for sharing.
We've heard anecdotal evidence that that's an age where you really do feel the caregiving crunch, which creates a level of isolation and loneliness as you're taking care of everyone else.
Yes, that would make sense. And it also, it's a similar reason for why during the pandemic, women was a group who became disproportionately lonely, often because they were having to deliver the care that they always were disproportionately having to deliver, but bereft of the kind of any sort of networks to help them, and then feeling increasingly lonely. So that would totally make sense that 50 to 59 age group could feel lonely in that way. There's also another reason that might account for that, and of course I'm just hypothesizing here, is the fact that we've seen this kind of exit from the workforce, disproportionate exit from the workforce of over 50s. So that might be playing to that as well.
Yeah, there were a couple of comments, people sort of talking about what happens when you do leave the workforce, because work for many people is social engagement, a sense of meaning and purpose. So
yes, work definitely can play an important role in helping you feel less isolated and more connected, but it's important not to romanticize the office of the past, because even when I was doing my research, 50% of office workers said at the time that they felt lonely at work. So I think for employers, recognizing that loneliness actually is a business cost, because lonely workers are less productive, because they're less motivated, because they're more likely to quit. The challenge for employers is, okay, how do I make my workplace how do I help people feel more connected to each other, my employees, especially now in this world in which people are not back to the office in all cases 5 days a week, and in some cases, looks like will never be. So and lots that employers have been doing to help people feel connected. A really something that is kind of incredibly successful is actually encouraging your staff or your teams or groups of staff to eat together. There was fascinating research done in Chicago with firefighters, and the researchers wanted to understand why certain groups of firefighters actually performed better than others. And what they found was that the groups who ate together didn't only perform better than the ones who didn't, but they also felt significantly less lonely. So, eating together is something that employers can do. Think about the physical architecture of the workplace. Open plan offices, counterintuitively, it turns out, make people feel especially lonely. Because I don't know if you experienced working in an open plan office, but I mean, I know that when I did, I had my noise cancelling headphones on so that I could concentrate, signaling very clearly to everyone, don't come and speak to me. And people often in an open plan office, won't have the intimate conversations that actually you need to build relationships, because everyone can listen in. So open plan offices, think about your office design is really important moving forward if you want to actually deliver on the community promise at work. And then actively having a policy of recognizing your staff is really important too, speaking to that sense of invisibility, which is part of feeling lonely. One American company whose board I'm on, called Workhuman, actually has a product which whereby companies are able to reward, whereby employees are able to recognize and reward fellow employees up or down the organization for being particularly kind, helpful, cooperative. And companies who use this service have found significant improvements in employee turnover, in employee engagement, and in productivity. So again, speaking to, there is a business case for this as well, not only a moral imperative.
We've started moving the conversation organically to solutions, and maybe we can sort of focus on that. We started with the challenges, and now we can talk to solutions. And there was actually a specific question I wanted. You said something and it caught the attention of some people in our audience, which is the notion that there are intergenerational living opportunities being pioneered in Europe. Let me ask you this, Noreena, what has caught your attention on that? I mean, what places do you think are interesting models that can be studied and perhaps scaled?
So and I've done quite a lot of research and thinking into co-living spaces, and I think they fall into two categories. I mean, this is broadly speaking, one are the kind of categories that, like, we may think of it as the we washed categories. So the kind of we live environments where it's very clearly branded we community, but actually when you start digging into it, these are buildings where maybe there is a free bagel brunch, but people often will pick up their bagel and take it back. So there are those communities where where community is being used as a kind of sales term, in the same way that goods might be branded environmental but actually be greenwashed because they're not. And then there are the communities which actually do seem to be delivering on this sense of these living spaces, which do seem to be delivering much more on this promise of community. And the thing which those have in common, having looked at a number, is that they do have they typically have a considerable degree of co-creation in their execution, by which I mean, instead of the organizers laying on a bagel brunch, they might have a potluck dinner, which residents then are encouraged to come and bring something at and contribute to. instead of having a concierge, laying out some activities, it's much more kind of tenant and resident led as to what's going to be done. And it really does feel that if we build it, they will come, but if they build it, they will stay. So I think when we're thinking about the best co-living examples, they do seem to have this element of, if we build it, we will stay. And the intergenerational specifically, I think there have been some interesting pilots around students and retirees. So, a group who's kind of, going to come for a few years, be in a place and leave, which have been pretty successful. And there have been ones, I'm thinking about one in the UK, which I recently looked at, where which was all female, but really a very wide range of ages. And it was actually beautiful to see kind of the stories of the residents in their 90s who had inspired the residents in their 30s. And this kind of exchange of experience and ideas was all very, was very beautiful. So there's something, it's not enough to have the space. It's about kind of how you live in these spaces and the contributions you really are making. And so I think there has to be also a particular mindset of the people who are choosing to be in these spaces as well. That they do want to be part of a community. It's part of that this really is part of the reason they're there.
There's a community in Oregon called Bridge Meadows, which is a very intentional, multi-generational community that brings together seniors, former foster kids, and their adoptive families, and with sort of wraparound services. But it was put together with the idea that older people and younger people, young kids who may have felt trauma at some point, could benefit by these shared living spaces. So I think there are 2 or 3 of them in Portland. Yeah.
Inspiring.
Oh, Kate found it.
Yeah. Good work, Kate. So can we talk about, Noreena, about technology, which you have sort of fingered as one of the big causes of loneliness in this century? How do you put it feels like somehow the genie's out of the bottle. I think about sort of, how do I take the phone away from my son? I think I would not bring a hand back if I tried. How do we as a society address some of the ills of technology in a realistic way, given sort of the omnipresence of technology in people's lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that there were things which were our freedoms that we did kind of matter of course, which then did get taken away from us, like smoking, like driving without a seatbelt. So I mean, there are things which are kind of which maybe at a point of time you might have thought, wow, that's never going to be restricted. And if we do recast social media companies as the tobacco companies of the 21st century, the imperative for governments regulating them much more seriously becomes much clearer. And this isn't pie in the sky. In the United Kingdom, we actually have a bill that's currently going through Parliament, the Online Safety Bill, which actually is going to put a much more stringent duty of care on social media companies to not exact psychological harm, especially on young people, and actually holding directors, and will hold directors personally liable, criminally liable, if they don't actually uphold the legislation. So there is stuff going on kind of at a regulatory level in the United Kingdom and actually elsewhere in Europe and in Australia and New Zealand legislation as well, pending in South Korea, something that I've been discussing with legislators there. So there is action happening on that front, and it's actually, in the United States, a rare subject that you have actually bipartisan support. Often on, and I think also on social media, we talk about you can't take your kid's phone away. Actually, the UK's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, in a speech this week, announced that schools, children will no longer be able to use their phones during classes, which is kind of government stepping in there. So, and I think, whatever your beliefs about personal freedoms, I think, again, if you acknowledge the addictive nature of social media and the fact that it's been designed to be addictive, you realize that much as we can try as individuals to restrict our usage of social media or our phones, and I take a digital Sabbath, so one day a week where I'm not on my phones. I do in the evenings try and put my phone so it's not in reach, so that I can properly be present with my partner and friends. But it is hard because they are so addictive and designed to be addictive. So I think government stepping in is actually pretty essential, especially when it comes to young people, especially when we are now seeing very clearly the link between not only loneliness but self-harm, suicide, even, and social media amongst young people.
So, Martha, did you have a question?
No, you can take it.
So I'm curious. The UK has a minister of loneliness, and I've always been quite curious about what that person does and whether there's been sort of productive outcomes from the creation of that job.
So, so this is a position that has been in place for, I think, 5 years now, and I think it was a big moment when this position was created. It definitely brought attention to the fact that the UK was in the midst of a loneliness crisis. But when I started looking at what had the minister actually delivered, unfortunately, it was not that much. Partly because the budget the minister was given was pretty insignificant. So yes, the minister was able to make grants to good organizations who are definitely doing important things in their communities, boxing clubs for girls, and places where men could go and do sewing, and I don't know what do men do with DIY.
Not sewing, I don't think, but maybe
sewing.
Sawing, yeah. Well, I don't do either of those.
So they were giving grants to these small organizations, and that obviously these organizations obviously do something, but the ministry, small budget, not with no voice more broadly in government. And of course, so many of these drivers are more structural, so having no impact there, not at that time being part of the conversation around restricting social media usage. So I'd say limited. So I think, is a post necessary? I mean, it's in Japan, they've now actually also got a minister of loneliness. This was just in the last year that they've introduced one. Other countries' governments do ask me, is this something we should be doing? But I'm not convinced. I think it's good to have somebody with public profile within government talking about loneliness, like of course your Surgeon General is doing. I think it's great to have someone high status with a voice, but in terms of the impact they're going to have, unless they really have significant funds or significant voice, I think it's going to be less suboptimal.
So we paint a pretty grim picture of what today looks like with regards to loneliness. Are you optimistic about what the future will bring, or you're like, okay, maybe?
Well, ultimately the choice is ours to make, isn't it? And there is a trajectory where we just increasingly embrace our contactless lives, where we trade off connection and community for convenience, where we sit in our rooms with our virtual reality headsets on and kind of experience worlds on our own and only hang out with our AI-enabled social robots. So there is that trajectory for sure, but there is also another one. There is one in which we do reconnect with each other, and where we do practice more regularly the skills that underpin democracy, reciprocity, civility, thinking about others, not only ourselves, where we do more things with other people, where we care about other people more. So there are kind of these two paths, and it is partly about the choice we as a society want to make. But what's really important to recognize is that the stakes are very high, and that if we don't address the loneliness crisis, we have the ticking, the health ticking bomb. If we don't address the loneliness crisis, there is a significant economic impact. If we don't address the loneliness crisis, there is a significant impact on our democracies. So my hope lies in the fact that firstly, the business case is strong, and that we will see increasing innovation when it comes to addressing the loneliness problem, and we already are. The number of AI startups who are reaching out to me on an almost daily basis, who are trying to address loneliness with tech, with AI. The companies who are developing social robots, the companies who are doing things in the physical spaces and seeing this reap rewards, the fact that amongst young people, music festivals, nightclubs, bars are experiencing, kind of boom times despite the economy, definitely points to the fact that the market definitely has a part to play here. Governments, I think we can take hope from the fact that across the world, there are lots of examples of governments doing things, whether it is the UK government taking on social media, whether it is in Belgium, the empty shop tax, which is levied upon landlords who are leaving their shops empty for protracted periods, holding out for higher rents, seeking to address the devastation of Main Street, which is contributing to the loneliness many people feel in their own communities and a lack of spaces to do things and interact. Whether it's in America, the branches of the Chicago Public Library that were embedded on the ground floor of social public housing that was created under Rahm Emanuel. There are examples actually from across the world of governments actually doing things, and then examples of people leading, doing things themselves, initiating things. If you think back to those early days of the pandemic, there was for many people a kind of greater sense of solidarity and community in those early moments, and there were those beautiful stories of people helping other people and bringing groceries for people who couldn't go out, and and caring about each other. I think being there for others is, despite the neoliberal mindset, a pretty innate human trait. I think ultimately we are creatures of togetherness, and if we lean into that, then I actually can be nothing but hopeful and optimistic.
So great way to end the conversation, Noreena, with that note of encouragement. So thank you for such a great conversation, and remind everyone, book The Lonely Century. It's a wonderful book. So thank you again, Noreena, for this.
It also has a different cover.
Yeah, a different subtitle, but that will be for a different conversation. So thank you, Noreena. I hope you will also join us in the 4th Century Summit that will be held on November 6th and 7th, where among many other topics, we will continue our exploration of loneliness, community, and how to restore connection. For those particularly interested in this topic, you'll not want to miss Mark Friedman, the founder and co-CEO of CoGenerate, talk with Eddie Garcia, the founder and board chair of the Foundation for Social Connection. And also please join us for our next book club event on November 30th, when Martha and I will talk with elder justice expert M.T. Connolly, the author of the new book, The Measure of Our Ages, where she investigates the system of justice designed to protect us as we age. Thank you again, Noreena, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Noreena, and thank you, everybody.